The mahogany doors closed behind me with a heavy thud that felt more like a gavel than wooden hinges. The air in Jacob's office was cold, sterile, untouched by the warmth we once shared here. He leaned back in the leather chair we had picked out together years ago, only now it looked like a throne. Melissa stood at his side in a crimson dress, her manicured hand resting on his shoulder like a queen staking her claim. And me, I was the ghost of a co-founder, summoned only to be erased. Before we dive into true revenge stories, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Hearing from people around the world makes these stories even more powerful and reminds us how connected we all are. Jacob didn't waste time. He slid a crisp envelope across the desk, his wedding band glinting in the morning light as if mocking me. Effective immediately, he said, his voice rehearsed, polished for maximum cruelty. "You're terminated. Security will escort you out." The words should have shattered me. 8 years of building this empire, my code, my sleepless nights, my sacrifices dismissed in a single breath. But instead of breaking, I smiled. Because unlike Jacob, I knew something he didn't. In exactly 10 minutes, the empire he claimed as his own would start to crumble. I glanced at the corner of my phone screen where a subtle notification blinked. 9:00 a.m. The timer I had set hours earlier was awake now, ticking silently toward destiny. 10 minutes. 10 minutes until every tiny vulnerability I had planted would shift from harmless anomaly to catastrophic chain reaction. Melissa's voice cut through the silence like a knife dipped in honey. "It's for the best, Brenda. You've been unstable. This transition is necessary for the company's future." Her words were measured calm, the way a surgeon announces the removal of a tumor. But I heard the undertone gloating possession, the triumph of someone who thought she'd won. I met her gaze without blinking. "Enjoy your victory lap, sweetheart. It lasts 10 minutes. Jacob mistook my composure for defeat. "You can keep your old laptop," he said with mock generosity. "Sentimental value." I let my hand rest on the handle of the battered bag, the same one I carried when NextCore was nothing but an idea scribbled on pizza boxes. Inside that outdated MacBook wasn't just sentiment, it was a key, a memory vault, and unbeknownst to him, a detonator. Gary from HR shuffled awkwardly in the corner, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "Security will walk you to your desk," he murmured as if apologizing. I nodded once, collected the envelope, and turned without another word. My heels echoed on the polished floor as I crossed the lobby, a rhythm steady enough to mask the storm inside me. Employees looked up, some curious, some pitying, others avoiding eye contact altogether. They'd been told their CTO was unstable. They'd been primed to see me as fragile, unfit, disposable. I carried the box of my personal belongings, a coffee mug, a framed photo, meaningless trinkets like an actress in a scene that had been staged without her consent. But my true belonging was invisible, hidden in strings of code that pulsed quietly beneath the company's glittering surface. Outside, the January air was sharp, slicing into my lungs with every breath. I paused on the sidewalk, placing the box down on the concrete, and finally allowed myself a small, private smile. Freedom. Not the kind you ask for, the kind you take. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, the leather cold against my palms. The laptop bag rested in the passenger seat like a co-conspirator. I opened my phone again. 9:08. 2 minutes. That's when I want you, the audience, to imagine standing in my shoes, after years of loyalty, of being gaslit, erased, betrayed by both the man I married and the woman I welcomed. You're told you're nothing. What would you do in those final minutes? Cry, beg, or smile, knowing justice was written line by line in the very system your betrayers stole from you? The parking garage echoed around me, doors slamming, footsteps, hurrying life, moving on as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because in 2 minutes, NextCore's perfect facade would fracture. In 2 minutes, Jacob would finally understand what it felt like to underestimate the wrong woman. At 9:10 a.m., my phone vibrated once. A single word appeared on the hidden app I had built months earlier, active. A rush of calm flooded me, deeper than relief, steadier than rage. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about truth. The truth that brilliance doesn't vanish just because someone signs a termination letter. The truth that betrayal has consequences. I started the engine, easing the car up the ramp toward daylight. As I reached street level, I rolled the windows down, letting the Seattle rain mist my face. Across the road, NextCore's glass tower shimmered like nothing was wrong. But I knew better. Inside those walls, the countdown had already begun. And this moment, right here, is where our story truly starts. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Texas, California, Lagos, Manila, Sydney? Drop your location in the comments. Because betrayal, justice, and resilience, they don't belong to just one city or one story. They belong to all of us. Now buckle up. The next 11 chapters will show you how a single woman armed only with her code and her courage brought down an empire worth $8 million. When the notifications on my phone flashed active at 9:10 a.m., part of me wanted to sit back and savor the chaos I knew was about to unravel. But stories like this never start in the moment of victory. They start years earlier in places no one imagines. So let me take you back before the glass towers and the corporate betrayals, back to a cramped apartment in Seattle where everything began. It was raining, of course. Seattle rain thin and steady, tapping against the window like a drummer who didn't know when to stop. Jacob and I sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, a couple of empty pizza boxes between us, laptops balanced on our knees. The heat barely worked, so we wrapped ourselves in mismatched blankets, drinking cold coffee that had been reheated twice already. Most couples in their late 20s were saving for weddings or planning trips to Europe. We were sketching a dream on the backs of grocery receipts and envelopes, a dream called NextCore Solutions. "Imagine it," Jacob had said, pacing the tiny living room, waving his arms like a conductor in front of an invisible orchestra. A system that doesn't just react to hackers but predicts them. We'd be years ahead of anyone else. If you're still watching, comment 1, so I know you're still with me. I remember pushing my glasses up my nose, my fingers flying over the keyboard. "I can build that," I told him. "Give me 3 months, and I'll create something no one's ever seen before." He stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes so full of belief that it almost hurt. Then he kissed me right there in the middle of the chaos, with half-eaten breadsticks on the floor beside us. "This is why I love you, Brenda. You make the impossible possible." Those days were pure magic. We lived on energy drinks and late-night burritos, coding until sunrise, pitching ideas to anyone who would listen. Jacob had a silver tongue. He could convince a skeptical investor that fire was wet if he wanted to. I didn't have his charisma, but I had something else, code that worked. Code that could see patterns no one else could. We didn't have time for a big wedding. Instead, we bought a $200 dress online, drove down to the courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon, and said I do between 2 strangers who were waiting for their own license. When Jacob held my hands and whispered, "We're partners in everything 50-50, in business and in life," I believed him with every beat of my heart. 18-hour days blurred into weeks. Our apartment looked like a war zone. Tangled cords, whiteboards covered in half-erased equations, and stacks of ramen cups piled in the sink. But I didn't care. Every line of code I wrote felt like carving a future out of thin air. We celebrated our first real investor check with gas station champagne, drinking it straight from the bottle because we didn't own flutes. I remember laughing so hard I cried when Jacob raised the bottle and declared, "To NextCore, to Brenda, the real genius behind it all." He said it like a vow, and back then, I thought he meant it. When we signed our first $1 million contract 18 months later, we moved out of that apartment into a converted warehouse with exposed pipes and concrete floors. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. For the first time, I felt like we'd made it, like all those sleepless nights had been worth it. But looking back now, I see the shadows creeping in even then. Jacob started interrupting me during team meetings, clarifying my technical updates, as if the others couldn't understand me. He'd smile at clients and say, "Brenda's the technical genius, but I handle the vision." It sounded flattering, but each time he said it, he was pushing me further into the background. At the time, I brushed it off. I told myself he was just trying to make the business side more palatable to outsiders. I convinced myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as the company grew. But that was the first crack in the foundation. the first sign that the vows of 50-50 were already slipping. If Chapter 1 was about the end, then this chapter is about the beginning. Two dreamers with nothing but determination and trust in each other. And maybe that's why the betrayal hurt so much later, because it didn't just take away a job or a company. It shattered the memory of this living room, this rain-soaked city, and the promise whispered over cold coffee that we'd always be partners. Success doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It creeps in slowly, almost gently, until one day you wake up and realize your life looks nothing like it did a year ago. That's how it was with NextCore. One day, we were two dreamers huddled in a freezing apartment. The next, we were signing contracts worth more than I'd ever imagined. Within 18 months, we had moved into our first official office, a converted warehouse with exposed pipes and concrete floors. The kind of place that still smelled faintly of paint and dust, but hummed with possibility. I remember unlocking the door for the first time, running my hand across the rough concrete wall and thinking, "This is real. We did it." Our small team grew fast. Sarah, our lead developer, joined straight out of grad school and quickly became my right hand. Marcus, a database architect, brought structure to the chaos I created in code. We didn't have a cafeteria, but we had folding tables stacked with pizza boxes and energy drinks, and somehow that felt better. Every day was noisy, messy, alive. The first $1 million contract was like oxygen. Suddenly, investors wanted to meet us, journalists wanted to interview us, and competitors wanted to copy us. For me, it was proof that the endless nights and caffeine-fueled marathons had meant something. For Jacob, it was fuel for a different fire. I noticed it first during Monday morning meetings. I'd be halfway through explaining a technical breakthrough, describing how our predictive algorithm had identified a new class of potential cyber attacks, when Jacob would step in with a smile. What Brenda means, he'd say, turning to the room like a patient teacher simplifying a lesson, is that our system keeps clients one step ahead of hackers. The team would nod grateful for the translation, but inside, I burned. He hadn't corrected me exactly, he'd just reframed my work in a way that made it sound like his insight. When I confronted him later, he laughed it off. "Honey, I'm just helping. You get lost in the weeds sometimes, and not everyone speaks your technical language. That's why we work so well together. I translate brilliance into business." It sounded reasonable at the time. And maybe that was the danger. Every dismissal, every interruption came wrapped in just enough logic to make me doubt myself. Client presentations became another stage for this new dynamic. I'd spend days preparing demos, fine-tuning every slide, every line of code, only to find myself sitting silently beside Jacob as he dazzled the room. "Brenda's our technical genius," he'd say with a charming smile. "She makes the magic happen behind the scenes." Behind the scenes. Those words stuck like a splinter. Wasn't I the co-founder? Wasn't I supposed to be standing shoulder to shoulder with him, not tucked away like some assistant whose job was to nod and smile? Still, I told myself not to complain. The company was growing, the money was flowing, and we were building something revolutionary. Surely that mattered more than whose voice carried in the room. But the cracks were forming. Small at first, an investor thanking Jacob for his algorithm, a journalist quoting him as the visionary, while I wasn't even mentioned. Each time Jacob brushed off my frustration. "It's just optics, Brenda. You know the truth. We know the truth." Did we? The final straw came one September afternoon during a board meeting. I had just completed a platform upgrade that increased processing speed by 300%. It was the kind of leap that made competitors jealous and clients ecstatic. This should have been my triumph. But when Jacob presented to the investors, my breakthrough became a collaborative effort led by our technical department. One of the board members, Richard Thompson, frowned and asked, "Don't you mean led by Brenda?" Jacob chuckled smooth as ever. "Of course Brenda's our CTO, but she'd be the first to tell you this was a team win." The investors nodded satisfied, and the meeting moved on. I sat frozen, my throat tight, unable to contradict him without looking petty. Melissa, our new operations manager, sat beside him taking notes with her professional calm. Just doing her job. That night, lying awake in the dark while Jacob snored beside me, I realized something fundamental had shifted. NextCore was no longer our company. Somewhere between the folding tables and the boardroom suits, it had become his company. And me, I was just another employee who happened to share his bed. Looking back, that was the first true warning sign, the moment the foundation of trust began to rot. I didn't know it yet, but the storm was already on the horizon. The first time I met Melissa, she didn't look like a threat. She was polished in that effortless way that made you think of glossy magazine ads, sleek ponytail-tailored blazer, not a single smudge on her pale pink nails. Jacob introduced her as our new operations manager, the missing piece that would streamline the chaos. We need someone who can handle logistics so Brenda can focus on coding. Jacob explained, his hand brushing Melissa's elbow in a gesture that seemed casual, maybe too casual. Melissa smiled warmly, her voice low and smooth. I've admired NextCore for a long time. You've built something extraordinary here, Brenda. Her words were honey, but the way she held Jacob's gaze told me her loyalty lay elsewhere. At first, I tried to welcome her. I'd been drowning in tasks that had nothing to do with engineering vendor contracts, scheduling investor calls, even ordering snacks for the team. If Melissa could take that weight off me, maybe I could breathe again. And for a while, she did. She reorganized files, negotiated deals, and charmed clients with the same ease Jacob had. The board adored her. The team admired her efficiency. Jacob sang her praises at every opportunity. Melissa's a lifesaver, he'd say, clinking his glass of bourbon after late-night meetings. She sees the big picture. Just like me. Just like me. That phrase cut deeper than I admitted. The shift was subtle at first. Jacob started scheduling strategy sessions without me claiming they were high-level conversations I didn't need to sit through. When I asked why, he smiled. Melissa and I are just hammering out logistics. No need to waste your time. But soon those logistics became decisions about hiring, about investor presentations, about the very direction of NextCore. I'd walk into a boardroom and realize choices had already been made, my input reduced to an afterthought. One night, I stayed late debugging code when I heard laughter echoing down the hall. I followed the sound to Jacob's office. Through the glass wall, I saw them, Jacob leaning across his desk, Melissa perched on the edge, her heels dangling as she threw her head back in laughter. Papers were spread between them, but their eyes told another story. I froze. It wasn't physical, at least not yet, but intimacy radiated from the space between them. A kind of ease Jacob hadn't shown me in months. When I confronted him later, he dismissed my concerns. "Brenda, don't be ridiculous. She's my colleague. We're just blowing off steam. You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining the way he started coming home later and later, or how Melissa began finishing his sentences in meetings, sentences that used to be mine, or how her perfume lingered faintly on his jacket when he tossed it carelessly onto our bed. The final confirmation came during a quarterly investor call. I had prepared a detailed technical roadmap, hours of careful work. Halfway through my presentation, Jacob cut me off. "Melissa, why don't you explain how this fits into our broader strategy?" She slid seamlessly into the spotlight, clicking to a slide I hadn't approved. "What Brenda's roadmap demonstrates," she said smoothly, "is that NextCore is positioned not just as a security company, but as an industry leader, redefining predictive analytics." The investors applauded. Jacob beamed. And me, I sat in silence, my voice erased from my own creation. That night, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I realized something devastating. Melissa wasn't just an operations manager. She was Jacob's partner now in business, and maybe in ways I couldn't yet prove. The woman who was supposed to lighten my load had instead replaced my place. She had slipped into the spaces where I once stood, the late-night strategy talks, the client dinners, even the moments of casual laughter. Piece by piece, she was rewriting the story of NextCore, and Jacob was letting her. By our 4th year, NextCore had become a name whispered in every major boardroom from Seattle to New York. Contracts poured in, investors circled like hawks, and the press hailed us as the cybersecurity darlings of the Pacific Northwest. The office had transformed from a bare warehouse into a gleaming, open-concept space with glass walls, ergonomic chairs, and a break room stocked with kombucha taps and organic snacks. I should have felt proud. I should have looked around and seen the proof of my sweat, my nights at the keyboard, my stubborn refusal to give up. Instead, I felt like a ghost haunting the empire I had built. Jacob had become the face of the company, the visionary CEO quoted in Forbes, photographed shaking hands with senators, laughing with tech giants at rooftop cocktail hours. His charisma, once our shared advantage, now cast a shadow so wide I could barely find room to stand in it. Melissa was always by his side. She had gone from operations manager to chief strategy officer in less than a year, her title ballooning with her influence. She handled investor calls that used to be mine, drafted memos with Jacob that excluded me entirely, and sat at his right hand in meetings while I found myself pushed further down the table. The breaking point came at our annual shareholder summit, a glittering event held at the downtown Westin, complete with chandeliers and a stage flanked by giant screens broadcasting Nextcore's logo. The room was packed, employees in crisp suits, board members in designer ties, journalists angling for quotes. I had prepared my segment for weeks. My slides detailed a major system upgrade and achievement that increased predictive accuracy by 40%. It was the kind of breakthrough that could secure our dominance in the market. When my turn came, I walked to the podium, the click of my heels amplified by the microphone feedback. I started speaking, my voice steady, despite the weight of 100 eyes. But 2 minutes in, Jacob stood. "Let me clarify what Brenda's trying to say." He interrupted smoothly, striding to the podium as if it were his birthright. He turned to the audience with that practiced smile that had won him so many deals. The real significance of this upgrade is how it positions Nextcore strategically, and Melissa will walk you through the details. The spotlight shifted, literally. A technician redirected the beam onto Melissa as she glided to the stage, her presentation already loaded onto the screens. My slides vanished in an instant, replaced by hers. I froze. My hands still clutched the clicker, but I no longer controlled anything. My voice had been cut mid-sentence, my work absorbed into theirs like water into sand. The audience erupted in applause at Melissa's polished delivery. Jacob beamed at her, then at the crowd, as if the two of them had just conducted a flawless duet. My name was mentioned only once. Brenda's team supported the technical side before being buried beneath their narrative. I felt the humiliation burn hotter than any fever. But worse than the shame was the realization that this was intentional. This wasn't a slip or a misunderstanding. Jacob had chosen this stage, this moment, to show the world that I was dispensable. After the summit, I found him in the green room sipping champagne with Melissa and several board members. My chest ached with anger. "You cut me off," I said, my voice low but sharp. "That was my work, my presentation." Jacob didn't flinch. "It's not about you, Brenda. It's about the company. Melissa and I are aligned on the vision, and sometimes that means adjusting the spotlight." Melissa smiled faintly, her eyes glittering with unspoken triumph. "You're invaluable in the background," she added, "but leadership is about presence." Background. That word again. Something inside me cracked. I realized that Jacob wasn't just minimizing me, he was preparing the stage for my exit. Every stolen slide, every public dismissal, every subtle reframing had been part of a larger script, and I was being written out. The whispers started soon after. Employees confided in hushed tones that Jacob and Melissa were discussing structural changes. My calendar invites to board meetings mysteriously vanished. HR requested updated documentation of my role for compliance purposes. And then came the storm, the literal one. The night Jacob made it official, he didn't pull me aside privately. He chose the grand stage of humiliation under the gray Seattle rain, with Melissa watching from the glass lobby as security escorted me out. But that, my friends, is the story of the next chapter. Seattle rain has a way of finding every weakness, every gap in your umbrella, every seam in your coat. That night, it found mine. The board meeting had stretched past 9, tension thick enough to choke on. Jacob sat at the head of the long mahogany table, Melissa at his right hand, her pen gliding across a leather notebook like she was chronicling my execution. "Let's not drag this out," Jacob said. Finally, his voice calm, rehearsed. "The board has agreed. Effective immediately, Brenda Carter will be relieved of her duties as Chief Technology Officer." The words hung in the air, heavier than thunder. For a moment, no one moved. Sarah, my most loyal developer, looked down at her lap, her hands trembling. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat as though wishing he could vanish. No one dared to meet my eyes. I opened my mouth, but Jacob raised a hand, silencing me the way you'd hush a child. You'll retain your shares, of course. 48%. We're not unreasonable. His gaze sharpened. But NextCore needs unified leadership. That's not you. Melissa leaned forward, her perfume sweet and suffocating. We do appreciate everything you've done, Brenda. Truly. But vision requires consistency. You've struggled with that lately. I wanted to scream, to shout that the code was mine, the algorithms mine, that the empire they sat upon had been carved out of my sleepless nights and raw determination. But the words died on my tongue. The betrayal was too complete. Security entered the room, a pair of men in dark suits, expressionless. The kind who don't ask questions, only follow orders. Escort her out, Jacob instructed. His tone was final surgical. My chair scraped against the hardwood as I stood. The envelope of termination papers lay waiting at the end of the table, its corners sharp against the polished surface. I left it there. The walk through the lobby felt endless. Dozens of employees sat frozen at their desks, pretending to focus on glowing screens, but sneaking glances as I passed. Some looked guilty. Others looked curious. A few almost relieved. The narrative had already been written, Brenda the unstable co-founder. Brenda the obstacle. As I stepped outside, the rain hit me full in the face, cold, merciless. It plastered my hair to my skin and soaked through my coat within seconds. Security didn't offer an umbrella. They didn't need to. The humiliation was the point. Melissa stood behind the glass doors, arms crossed, her silhouette framed by the glow of the lobby lights. Jacob joined her, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on her shoulder. Together, they watched me like spectators at a play, certain they'd just witnessed the final act. For a moment I believed them. My chest ached, my knees shook, and the thought of starting over felt impossible. 8 years of my life had just been ripped away, discarded like a smudged draft no one wanted to reread. I stumbled toward the parking garage, clutching the box they'd let me carry out my coffee mug, a framed photo, a few scattered notes. The kind of box that screams failure. My old laptop bag slid against my hip, heavier than it looked. When I reached my car, I sat inside with the door closed, the sound of the rain hammering the roof like a war drum. For the first time in months, I let the tears come. Not quiet tears, but raw, racking sobs that shook my entire body. Yet even in that collapse, something stirred. A flicker of defiance, faint but alive. My fingers brushed against the laptop in the passenger seat. The so-called souvenir Jacob thought meant nothing. He had no idea what lived inside that machine, no idea the kind of power he had just handed me. Through the windshield, the glass tower of NextCore loomed against the night sky, every window glowing like a victory banner. But I knew better. Empires built on betrayal don't last. I wiped my face, started the engine, and whispered to the empty car, "This isn't over." The rain poured harder, but this time I didn't care. The morning after my firing, Seattle was still drenched. The city wore the same gray as my mood, but inside me something had shifted. The humiliation of the night before had burned away, leaving behind a sharper, cleaner fire resolve. I brewed a pot of bitter coffee in my tiny kitchen, sat at the wobbly table, and opened my laptop. The familiar hum of the machine felt like a heartbeat steady alive, waiting for me to command it. Jacob thought he'd stripped me of everything, but he had overlooked two things: my brain and my code. By noon, I had sketched out a plan on the back of a grocery receipt. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Consulting. Companies desperate for cybersecurity solutions didn't care that I no longer had NextCore's glossy office or PR team. They wanted results, and results were my language. I called Sarah first. My voice trembled when I explained what had happened, but she didn't hesitate. "Tell me where to be," she said. "I'm with you." Marcus joined 2 days later. Then another developer, then a data scientist who had quietly messaged me after the firing. They weren't just loyal to me, they were loyal to the work, to the belief that truth mattered more than Jacob's polished lies. We rented a cramped co-working space above a Thai restaurant. The walls smelled faintly of lemongrass and fried garlic, but I didn't care. Every morning we climbed the narrow stairs, laptops under our arms, determination in our eyes. Our desks were scarred, our chairs mismatched, but the energy buzzing between us was undeniable. Clients trickled in faster than I expected. Within 2 months, I was billing more in consulting fees than my annual NextCore salary. Small firms, mid-sized banks, even a regional hospital, all willing to trust me with their networks because they trusted my reputation. Word spread. Brenda Carter wasn't gone. She was reborn. But success alone wasn't enough. I hadn't forgotten the glass tower, the smug tilt of Jacob's smile, the way Melissa's perfume lingered like victory in the boardroom. They had humiliated me publicly. If I walked away quietly, I'd be confirming their narrative that I was weak, replaceable. So while my team built our consulting pipeline, I prepared for something bigger. Revenge, not sloppy emotional revenge, but precise, calculated justice. Late at night, when the office emptied and the city quieted, I opened the hidden files on my laptop. Buried deep within were the safeguards I had built into NextCore's platform. Not sabotage, not exactly, more like a failsafe. A series of checks designed to ensure no one could exploit the system without me. Jacob thought firing me had severed my connection to NextCore. He didn't realize that my fingerprints were in every line of code. He didn't realize the platform still listened for me. I refined the sequence carefully, line by line, disguising it as maintenance routines and diagnostic checks. Nothing flashy, nothing detectable. Just a clock, quietly ticking toward a moment of reckoning. It wasn't about destroying NextCore entirely. I wasn't that reckless. It was about exposing the truth. Showing investors, employees, and the world that Jacob and Melissa weren't the visionaries they pretended to be. Without me, their empire was hollow. I taped a note to the wall above my desk written in black marker, "Dignity first," because that's what this was really about. Not money, not even revenge in the Hollywood sense. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had stolen from me when they marched me out in the rain. 2 months after the firing, I stood at the window of our makeshift office, watching the rain blur the neon lights outside. Behind me, Sarah laughed at a debugging joke Marcus ordered takeout, and the hum of laptops filled the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole, and yet deep in the code, the timer waited. Silent, patient, counting down to the day when Jacob would learn the truth: you can't erase the architect and expect the castle to stand. The first contract we landed was with a mid-sized bank in Portland. They had been hacked twice in 6 months, and NextCore had quoted them an obscene fee to fix it without real guarantees. I flew down with Sarah, presented our streamlined approach, and within a week we had the job. When the system went live, their CIO shook my hand and said, "You did more in 2 weeks than NextCore managed in 3 months." His words spread faster than I imagined. Suddenly my inbox filled with inquiries. Hospitals, credit unions, even a nonprofit that had nearly lost donor data. Each success felt like oxygen, not just money in the bank, but validation, proof that I was more than the label Jacob had tried to paste on me: unstable, replaceable. Within 3 months, our tiny office buzzed with momentum. We didn't have NextCore's marble lobby or PR firm, but we had something better: results. Clients recommended us. Referrals doubled. For the first time since that humiliating night in the rain, I felt powerful again. And while we climbed, Jacob began to stumble. The first sign came from a former colleague still inside NextCore. She called me late one night, whispering like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Brenda, the system's acting weird. Diagnostics are running longer than usual. Investors are restless. Melissa says it's fine, but it's not fine." I thanked her, hung up, and allowed myself the smallest smile. The safeguards I'd buried deep in the code were stirring, subtle enough not to crash anything outright, but disruptive enough to rattle confidence. Then the news articles started. A trade publication ran a headline: "NextCore slipping analysts question leadership stability." Jacob brushed it off publicly, of course. He gave interviews laughing, insisting everything was under control. But I saw the cracks. The smile that used to dazzle now looked strained, almost brittle. Melissa doubled down. She plastered her charm across investor calls, promising new strategies hinting at big deals that never materialized. Behind the gloss, though, employees began leaking complaints. High turnover, long hours, decisions made without consultation. Meanwhile, my team thrived. Sarah's designs were sharper than ever, Marcus's databases faster, and together we built a reputation for efficiency that made NextCore look bloated by comparison. I'll never forget the night one of NextCore's oldest clients, the very law firm Jacob had once bragged about landing, called me directly. Brenda, the managing partner, said, "We've lost faith in them. We want you." It wasn't just a contract. It was a statement. Jacob's empire was bleeding, and the wound was one he had inflicted himself the moment he thought he could erase me. At first, I tried not to gloat. I told myself this was just business. But then one rainy Tuesday, I saw a headline that made my breath catch: CEO Jacob Carter confronted by shareholders over missing CTO role. The article detailed a tense meeting where investors grilled him about NextCore's declining performance and the absence of the technical architect who had once been the backbone of the company. I could almost picture it: Jacob sweating under the fluorescent lights, Melissa at his side, her smile tighter than ever, both scrambling to explain away the truth everyone already suspected. That night I sat in our modest office above the Thai restaurant, listening to the hum of laptops and the laughter of my small but loyal team. I thought of Jacob standing in his gleaming tower, surrounded by luxury, yet crumbling from the inside out. And for the first time, I let myself imagine what victory might look like. Not just survival, not just dignity, but real, undeniable triumph. The safeguards in the code were still ticking patient as ever. The consulting business was growing faster than I had dared to hope. And Jacob, he was beginning to realize what it felt like to underestimate the wrong woman. The rain drummed steadily outside, but this time it didn't sound like morning. It sounded like a countdown. The ballroom at the Fairmont was dressed for triumph. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead, silver trays of champagne floated between clusters of investors, and a massive screen glowed with the NextCore logo. It was supposed to be Jacob's victory lap. The annual investor showcased the moment he would prove to the world that NextCore was still unstoppable. I sat near the back, blending in with the crowd, my black blazer unremarkable among the sea of suits. Few people noticed me slip in. Fewer still realized that beneath the calm mask on my face, a storm was already underway. At exactly 6:50 p.m., I tapped a single command into the hidden app on my phone. The screen pulsed once initiated. 10:00. The countdown had begun. On stage, Jacob strutted in his custom-tailored tuxedo, Melissa at his side in emerald silk. His smile was as wide as ever, but the edges cracked if you looked too closely. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice amplified through the ballroom. "NextCore is stronger than ever. Tonight we show you why the future belongs to us." The crowd applauded politely, though I caught the wary eyes of a few investors who had already been whispering doubts in recent weeks. Melissa took over, clicking through slides that promised growth curves and market dominance. Her voice was polished, her delivery flawless. But the data was about to turn to ash. At 6:52, the first tremor hit. A live demo of NextCore's predictive engine supposed to dazzle investors with seamless speed froze mid-calculation. Melissa clicked frantically, her smile stiffening. Jacob leaned in, whispering, trying to keep the performance alive. "Just a minor glitch," she said into the mic, her voice too bright. "We'll refresh." The refresh failed. On my phone, the timer ticked down to 07:56. Murmurs spread through the ballroom. Investors leaned forward confused. Jacob's jaw tightened. He gestured to the tech crew at the back, but I knew it wasn't their fault. The safeguards buried deep in the system were surfacing exactly as designed. At 6:55, the screen flickered. Lines of code scrolled across the massive display. Not random errors, but my signature routines, each stamped with a timestamp proving authorship. A hush fell. Jacob Carter terminated original architect January 14th, the text read, "System integrity compromised. Gasps rippled through the room. Melissa slammed her hand on the keyboard, but the text only multiplied, scrolling faster, like a confession written in digital ink. At 6:58, the Nextcore logo dissolved, entirely replaced by graphs of performance metrics, each showing decline since the day of my firing. Shareholders stared in silence as the numbers exposed the truth Jacob had buried. He grabbed the mic, his voice sharp now. "This is sabotage. A bitter ex-employee trying to destroy us." But before he could finish, the system pulled up archived video. Jacob himself, in a recorded boardroom call, dismissing me as unstable, while Melissa smirked beside him. The audio echoed through the ballroom like a verdict. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, cell phones raised to capture every second. My timer ticked, 6:59 p.m., 0100 remaining. Jacob's face flushed crimson. He lunged for the console, but security guards moved closer, not toward me but toward him. Shareholders were already barking orders, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits. At 7:00 p.m. sharp, the screen froze one last time, and then a single line appeared stark white on black. "Never underestimate the woman who built your empire." The ballroom fell silent. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, just the truth, hanging heavy in the air. When the lights snapped back to normal, Jacob looked small, sweat dripping down his temples, his tuxedo suddenly ill-fitting. Melissa's mask had cracked entirely. Her voice caught in her throat as investors turned on them both. I slipped out quietly before the chaos reached full pitch. Outside, the Seattle night air was cool and sharp, the rain holding off just long enough for me to breathe. My phone buzzed with messages from employees, clients, even journalists. But I didn't answer. Not yet. For me, the 10-minute countdown wasn't just about revenge. It was about truth. About showing the world that the castle Jacob tried to claim had always been mine. And as I walked away from the glowing tower, I knew this was only the beginning. By the next morning, the ballroom scandal was everywhere. Headlines blared across every major outlet. Nextcore implodes at investor showcase. Co-founders' legacy exposed. From visionary to villain. Jacob Carter's fall. Clips of the malfunctioning demo and the damning boardroom recording replayed on every news channel. The line of code I'd left behind, "Never underestimate the woman who built your empire," was already trending as a hashtag. I sat at my kitchen counter sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching the world finally see the truth. My phone vibrated endlessly. Investors, journalists, even employees who once avoided me in the hallways. Some sent apologies, others begged me to come back. Sarah's message stood out. "They know now, everything. Please, Brenda, the platform needs you." By noon, the board issued a public statement. Carefully worded but clear enough, Jacob Carter was suspended pending investigation. Melissa Rodriguez had resigned effective immediately. Both names were already radioactive in Seattle's tech circles. For Jacob, the punishment wasn't just professional, it was personal. Photos surfaced of him leaving his penthouse with boxes in hand, face-drawn eyes empty. Once the golden boy of cybersecurity, now a disgraced CEO abandoned by the very investors who once applauded him. I should have felt triumphant. And in part I did, but mostly I felt free. The weight I'd carried for months of betrayal, of silence, of being erased, was gone. That afternoon, I received an invitation to a private board session. Reluctantly, I went. The conference room, usually buzzing with overconfidence, was subdued. Richard Thompson, once so quick to dismiss me, greeted me with a firm handshake. "Ms. Martinez," he said, emphasizing my name with deliberate respect, "we owe you an apology." I didn't smile. "What you owe me is the truth, and the company owes its survival to the platform I built." Silence. Then Richard nodded. "We need you to take over, not just as CTO, as co-CEO." I glanced around the table. No one disagreed. The men who once looked past me now leaned forward, waiting for my answer like schoolboys, hoping to please the teacher. For a long moment, I said nothing. The power was intoxicating but also heavy. Returning meant tying myself again to a company poisoned by betrayal. Yet walking away meant leaving my life's work to rot. Finally, I spoke. "If I come back, it's on my terms. Complete technical authority. transparency in all finances, a public acknowledgement of my role as co-founder and chief architect, and most importantly, respect. Not just for me, but for every woman in this industry who's been silenced, sidelined, or stolen from. Richard exhaled. Done. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration. That night, I walked through the hushed Nextcore office for the first time since security escorted me out. Desks sat empty, monitors dark, but the heartbeat of the servers still pulsed in the background like an old friend waiting patiently for my return. I placed my hand on the glass door of the server room. "We're not finished," I whispered. Behind me, Sarah appeared tentative but hopeful. "Welcome back, Brenda." I smiled for the first time in weeks. No, this time it's welcome forward. The phoenix doesn't rise to reclaim ashes, it rises to build something stronger. And that's exactly what I intended to do. The first morning I officially stepped back into Nextcore as co-CEO, the office felt like a ghost town. Rows of empty desks stood as reminders of those who had fled when the ship was sinking. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of the servers. But the 12 employees who had stayed, the ones who had endured the chaos, looked at me with something Jacob had never earned: trust. I gathered them in the break room, which had become our makeshift command center. A whiteboard covered in half-erased scribbles leaned against the wall, coffee cups littered the table, and exhaustion was etched on every face. "Here's the truth." I began, my voice steady. Nextcore fell because the people leading it forgot why it existed. They chose ego over innovation, appearance over substance. That ends today. Sarah straightened in her chair, eyes glistening. Marcus, the quiet architect who once avoided my gaze, leaned forward. For the first time in months, I felt the weight of leadership return, not as a burden, but as a calling. We worked around the clock. Days blurred into nights fueled by takeout cartons and too much coffee. I reopened the code I had once booby-trapped and began closing the vulnerabilities one by one. Not out of vengeance this time, but out of purpose. Each line of code was like a stitch sewing together wounds left gaping for too long. But rebuilding a platform was only half the battle. The world had watched Nextcore collapse in real time. Clients had fled, investors had recoiled, and trust, our most valuable currency, was gone. So I made a decision. Jacob never would have. I went public. At a hastily arranged press conference, I stood alone at the podium. No Jacob, no Melissa, no polished PR team. Just me. Nextcore failed because it lost sight of its core values. I said, cameras flashing. I built this company to protect people, not to play politics. The vulnerabilities that surfaced were preventable, and I take responsibility for not stopping the betrayal sooner. But today, we begin again. Stronger, transparent, accountable. It was risky exposing the rot instead of covering it up. But honesty resonated. Within hours, my inbox filled with messages from companies impressed not by perfection, but by humility. One stood out, Paul Harrison from Pacific Financial, the man whose system I had saved at 200 a.m. months earlier. "If you're back at the helm, we'll return, but only if you personally guarantee the architecture." I typed my response carefully. I don't just guarantee it, I live it. Contracts followed. First Pacific, then Global SEC, then smaller firms who wanted the Brenda effect systems tested by fire and rebuilt with resilience. Inside the office, the energy shifted. Desks once abandoned filled again with new hires, engineers, analysts, visionaries drawn not by Jacob's empty charisma, but by the promise of working under someone who valued truth over theater. On the third week of my return, I called for an all-hands meeting. Standing in front of a projector that displayed our new mission statement, Security with Integrity, I looked out at the growing team. "You've all seen how fragile an empire can be when it's built on lies," I told them. "But when it's built on trust, on accountability, on respect, there's no storm we can't survive." Applause thundered through the room. Not polite, not forced, real. At night, when the office quieted and only the glow of my monitors kept me company, I thought about how far we'd come. Nextcore was no longer just a company. It was a testament, proof that from betrayal could come rebirth, from ashes could rise strength. And though Jacob still lingered in the shadows of board meetings, diminished and cautious, I no longer looked at him with anger. He had tried to erase me. Instead, he had immortalized me. Nextcore was mine again, not just the code, but the heart. And this time I wasn't sharing it. The city skyline shimmered against the twilight glass towers, glowing like embers after a long storm. From my office window, I could see the reflection of a woman I barely recognized, stronger, calmer, whole. 6 months had passed since the night Jacob's empire collapsed under the weight of his lies. 6 months since Melissa disappeared into obscurity, and since I stepped back into Nextcore not as a silent partner, not as someone's wife, but as its rightful leader. We were thriving again. Clients returned drawn not just by our technology, but by our transparency. Employees felt proud to be here. And me? I finally understood something I couldn't see in the heat of betrayal. Revenge, no matter how precise, is never the end of the story. One evening, Sarah knocked gently on my door. "He's here," she said. I knew before she finished who she meant. Jacob. He entered quietly without the arrogance that once preceded him. His suit was off the rack, his hair streaked with gray. He looked less like the powerful CEO who fired me and more like the boy I'd once shared late-night pizza with on our apartment floor. "Brenda," he said softly, "I came to thank you. For what I asked, cautious, for not destroying me completely. You could have. You had the power." His eyes flickered with shame. "And for proving me wrong. I thought you needed me to succeed. Turns out I was the one who needed you all along." For a long moment I studied him. The man who had betrayed my trust, stolen my credit, tried to erase my name. The wound he left had once felt like it would never heal. But now looking at him, I realized something vital. I was no longer angry. I remembered the verse from Galatians I had clung to in my darkest nights. "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap." Jacob had sown lies and he had reaped ruin. I had sown truth and I was reaping restoration. "You're right," I said finally. "I could have destroyed you. But what would that make me? Another version of you. And I won't carry that weight." His eyes filled with something I'd never seen before: gratitude. Maybe even relief. "I forgive you." I added the words, tasting strange but liberating. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." He nodded, unable to speak. When he left, I felt a weight lift I didn't realize I was still carrying. Later that night, alone in the office, I wrote in my journal, "Forgiveness doesn't excuse betrayal. It transforms it." Revenge gave me justice, but forgiveness gave me freedom. Weeks later, I was invited to speak at a global cybersecurity conference. Standing before thousands, I told my story not as gossip, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testimony. I stand here not because I was betrayed, I said, my voice echoing through the hall, but because betrayal did not break me. It revealed me. What is built on lies will crumble like sand, but what is built on integrity will stand forever. And yes, he who laughs last laughs best. But laughter born from cruelty fades. Laughter born from resilience, born from survival that endures. The room rose in applause, not for revenge, but for redemption. When I returned home, I poured a glass of wine and sat on my balcony overlooking the Seattle skyline. I opened my laptop and began drafting the company's new mission statement, "Nextcore exists to protect truth, because truth is the only foundation that lasts." And as I typed, I thought about everyone who had followed my journey, the clients, the employees, even strangers on the internet who found inspiration in my story. For them, I wanted to leave one last message. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice comes in many forms, share it. These are not just tales of betrayal, they are true revenge stories, stories of women and men who refused to stay silent, who turned pain into power, and who found in forgiveness the greatest victory of all. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment that struck you most? Where are you watching from? Because together these stories remind us that we are never truly alone. The city lights twinkled like a constellation of second chances. For the first time in a long time, I felt not just victorious, but free. Because revenge had ended Jacob's empire, but forgiveness, that was what set me free to build my own.